Hi everyone, this is Adrian Percy. Anyway, I'm really delighted to be here. This is my first time in New Zealand. I made it down with Air New Zealand. It was a wonderful experience. It's a long way from home. I'm actually based in Germany, and I'm a little bit jet lagged, so I've got my team down there. They're going to throw stuff at me if I just kind of suddenly freeze and get a bit glazed over. What I want to talk about is traceability from the perspective of an ag input provider. I mean, this is a very, very broad topic, and I think that will be reflected in the panel discussion. And a lot of us are coming at this from a different perspective. So we're coming from it as a company that is delivering ag input solutions to farmers. We're looking to encourage sustainable agricultural practices. And we're also coming at this from a very global perspective. Before I get into it, though, and since I've got the platform, I just wanted to say a couple of words about Bayer. You heard a little bit from Arima earlier on today about a little deal that we're going through with a company called Monsanto. Many of you will be familiar with Bayer. It's a little bit of an unusual company. It's one of the few companies that are actually trying to bring innovative solutions to help challenges in plant, animal, and human health. And we're doing this from a life science perspective. Many of you here who are working in agriculture in New Zealand will be familiar with our animal health division, which does a lot of work around dairy and beef production, as well as supporting the activities of beekeepers in New Zealand. I'm here representing the crop science division, which our areas of focus is more around crop protection chemistry, but also seeds. And we underpin that with a digital platform that actually allows growers to use our products in a more efficient and meaningful way. As I said, we're going through a deal right now with Monsanto. The intent is to strengthen the seeds part of our business, and we expect that deal to be completed in the coming weeks, at least in this quarter. And then with the combined entity as we move forward, we'll have a very strong seeds business, a strong crop protection business, and a stronger digital platform, and again with the idea of helping to bring new, innovative, and customized solutions to growers around the world. Before I talk about traceability, and this again is coming from the ag input perspective, I wanted to talk a little bit about the innovation disconnect that we see today in agriculture. We are all surrounded by amazing, fantastic innovation in our daily lives, and whether it's making our lives easier, watching movies, ordering cars, connecting with our friends, or actually in the industry that we work, there is a lot of innovation in technology, and I guess you guys are a great example of that. In the ag world, though, innovation isn't always welcomed by the consumer, and it's not always trusted by the consumer. And we see this with products such as GM, with chemistry that is used in the marketplace, and even with some of the new plant breeding innovation activities like gene editing, which I know in New Zealand is a big topic of conversation. Now, I think there's a number of reasons for that. I mean, first of all, I think all of us have a very strong emotional connection to food, and agriculture is part of our heritage, and traditional agriculture is something that many of us can identify through things that we saw when we were growing up, or perhaps our parents or even our grandparents. There's also a disconnect between those who produce our food and those who consume our food. Today in Western society, only about 2% of the population are actually producing food. And as we become more urbanized as a society, and the distance between the farm and the fork gets greater, we see this disconnect with agriculture, and people not understanding what agriculture is about, or what they understand or perhaps misunderstand, not liking. And that's where I believe the basis behind things like traceability become very, very important in terms of building trust with the consumer, that what they're getting is what we can show what they're getting, they can understand the provenance of their food, how it's being produced. And that traceability has to go along with transparency. It goes along with actually helping people understand what modern agriculture is all about and how producers produce our food for us. Now, I think there are a lot of food trends driving traceability and transparency. I mean, of course, We all want safe, nutritious food. We also want to understand how it's been produced and where it's come from, and that it's been produced in a sustainable manner. And I think these types of informations are being asked for more and more by consumers. We want to know that if we're paying a premium on food in terms of quality or nutritional value, that that is actually what we're paying for. We want to know that if we are looking to buy strawberries in Germany in the middle of winter, for instance, we want to understand what is the provenance of that strawberry. Is it being produced somehow locally in a hothouse, or has it been produced somewhere else on the planet and then shipped to us for our enjoyment? Some of the food scandals that we've had, and you mentioned some of those, where the food chain or the food system has become compromised. I give you examples a few years ago in Europe where we had a substitution of beef with horse meat, caused enormous discussion in society. And that, of course, has led to a degree to more regulation and more registration requirements moving forward. A lot of what the global retailers are doing now is pushing this back to the farm. So these sustainability requirements, which they believe are necessary to attain value with consumers, are being pushed all the way back to the farmer. And of course, it affects companies like Bayer as well. The last thing, perhaps, which is driving all of this from our perspective is the enabling technologies. And we've already talked a little bit about digitization and things like blockchain, which I guess we'll talk a little bit about later, but other ag tech opportunities that we have to actually do all this and actually join up an awful lot of dots and make something which is incredibly complex simpler. Now, Bayer is not the only company that looks into this and links things like traceability with topics like sustainability. And I won't ask you to read all the corporate jargon here, but the message from this slide is simply to say that all along the food chain, people are getting involved in these topics and trying to tackle what is something very complex. We at Bayer work in something we call the food chain partnership, where we actually try to join up those dots between the farmer and the consumer and everyone in between, whether it's food processors, whether it's importers, traders, retailers, whatever. And this is around sustainable agriculture. This is around helping growers finding new markets for their produce and helping them show to eventually to the consumer that the way that they've produced this food is sustainable and healthy. Before I talk a little bit about what we're doing in terms of tools, just to say as well, in terms of strengthening this food partnership or this food chain partnership, it's essential that there is a win-win for everybody. This is not just a cost, in my view, that can be pushed back to the grower. There has to be something in it for the farmer or the rancher that's producing our food. And that's why I think these partnerships become so important. So whether it's gaining access to new innovation that's acceptable from a societal level, whether it's getting advice on how to sustainably manage their operations and actually leave the farm in a better state than perhaps they found it from the previous generation. And then right down to the consumer, who's looking, of course, for safe, nutritious food, which is at a relatively reasonable cost. I want to give some examples. We have actually several hundred of these food chain partnerships going, and it really shows the complexity of dealing with this topic when you're dealing with so much geography, so many types of production systems. This one example is Fresh Select, so it's not too far away an example across in Australia. These are producers of lettuce and brassica vegetables. And this operation, like many others who are looking to, they have a domestic market, but they're also exporting to places like Southeast Asia, are struggling with a lot of the metrics and the certifications that are required around traceability. And so I'll let them tell you a little bit about what they've been doing.
In total, we've had about 58 years of farming experience. I've personally been involved for about 38 of those years. So So the requirements that we face when marketing our crops are basically food safety requirements. So we follow rigorous food safety laws, and we also have additional requirements placed on us by the customer. And we've also started to incorporate some environmental standards and audits that go alongside our food safety program. The starting point for partnering with Bayer Crop Science was around sustainability. So we were working on our own sustainability plan. We called it our nurture plan, in fact, and Bayer had a very similar program centering around sustainability. So we thought, let's get this together and explore the synergies, but more importantly, let's be able to measure it. Let's be able to measure our performance and measure our improvements, both from an environmental standpoint, an integrated pest management standpoint. In order to comply with the strict quality requirements, we employ 5 people full-time taking care of all of our quality assurance and all of our quality control against our products. Additional to that, we have Infield Inspection that takes place whilst we're harvesting across every farm, across every state of Australia.
So that's one example in Australia. There are many more. Another example that we like to talk about is in India, a producer of table grapes. Now, these table grapes are exported for the most part to the European market, where there are obviously regulations in terms of residue levels, but there are also secondary regulations which are coming from food retailers in terms of their expectation of the level of residue, chemistry residue on the crop. And we work with groups like this to actually help them design a spray program, so at the end of the day they're actually able to deliver a virtually zero residue crop to the retailer. That, of course, helps them in terms of the exportable market, but we're also working with them in a way that actually we're able to increase their yields through advice and agronomic discussions. And this is a real win-win for everybody. So those were just some examples and just a couple of the tools that we're using. We have one called Bay Gap. This is around good agricultural practices. Again, the idea is to encourage growers and help growers grow their produce in a more sustainable manner, which helps them in terms of sustainability metrics, but it also helps them in terms of getting access to global markets. And so a lot of this is centered around developing countries and smallholder farmers. I mean, basically, it's a pretty simple program, but we've done it at scale. So it's around actually doing training for growers, for farmers, with either our reps or with agronomists that are resident in the region. It's actually getting onto their farms, their operations, and helping them with more specific questions that they might have. And then finally, it's about helping them to verify and to demonstrate actually that they've followed these practices, which again helps them access markets that perhaps otherwise they would not be able to access. As I say, it's quite a big program. I mean, we have quite high ambitions about how we'd like to expand it to around 50,000 farmers around the world. We're already in 19 countries, and this is a big effort from our part, but we really see it as a win-win for ourselves, but also for the grower. Another tool that we're developing is called the Bayer Field Passport. So this is actually a digitized tool. It's a very simple tool. It's an app that we're actually doing, and this can allow electronic records to be created, which is more easy, obviously, to pass on to wholesalers and have them see exactly how the produce has been developed. So as I say, it's simple. Basically, ourselves or the farmer himself or herself actually load the information into a smartphone. Basically, they get an ID to show that this is associated with a particular harvest. This is uploaded, and then this is shared with the wholesalers. And again, it's a way of opening markets for those growers that perhaps they wouldn't have had otherwise. One thing is traceability, but I did want to also talk about transparency, and again about this disconnect that we see, I believe, between the consumer and the producer. There are many things and many ways that we can overcome that gap, and it's fantastic, for instance, to see in many parts of the world that growers are getting much more active in telling their story. I mean, one of the things that we see continually from surveys that we do is that when it comes to trust, consumers do trust farmers perhaps more than any other population that we have, even more than medical doctors sometimes, believe it or not. And I think this trust is based in the belief that farmers are always trying to do the right thing. I don't know if people always like the methods that farmers are using, but I think there's a general trust in those growers. Another area that we're trying to work on is actually being more transparent as a company with the data that we're generating. We've had a lot of pushback from NGOs and from members of the public about wanting to have more insight into the safety data that we actually generate when we develop a new, for instance, crop protection product. What we've decided to do is put all of those data actually on a website which is open to all. So if you Google Bayer transparency, you'll get to the website. It's something that we're working on, so we have some of our products on right now, and the intent is to add more later. But eventually to have our whole product range there, where anyone, any member of the public, can go in and actually see the results of studies that have been done on products that potentially could have residues in their food. And I think that's the right way to go, and I hope that the rest of the industry follows us in the next few years. So that was how I wanted to frame the discussion. Again, the whole topic around traceability, which I believe is strongly linked to sustainability, is a very complex one. But ultimately what we're trying to do is link all of those dots in the food chain, right from the farmer all the way across to the consumer. And I think the whole aspect of transparency is so important to actually creating openness in our food production systems, to create a dialogue, if you like, with the public, which I think that they're looking for from us. And ultimately, of course, with the goal of building trust with them and trust in our food supply. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Adrian, and for setting that scene for us. And it's going to be great to draw on Ian and David's different and very complementary expertise. Can I just set the framework in two other ways, in additional ways? The first one is, although the title is Traceability, which suggests we're trying to find out where things go wrong and we want to go back to the source and that kind of stuff. But I want to set that very big picture that it's about being able to tell the complete story to consumers. And I know that's what you've been saying with the likes of the Bayer passport there. So are we happy to deal with that very big picture of not just about traceability back to source, but being able to bring the attributes forward from the farm and the food producer right in front of the consumers? So are we happy with that? Setting that big context? Yes? Okay. Good. Now here comes the big one though, and it's prompted by a question from Andy in the audience here, and he asked, "What is sustainable about global food production system that is driving the 6th great mass extinction in the history of the Earth?" So we've got...
I'll happily address that, but I want to give someone else an opportunity to talk first. Maybe.
No, it's all right. We were going straight into the questions. You know, no, look, it's a really big question, but if we look, for example, at the way we're producing food now, we know that it's, in aggregate, the biggest driver of of climate change. It's also a very big driver of land use change and all the rest. And so the heart of this question is, are we just trying to perfect an existing system or rely on incremental change, or are we taking seriously the very big picture about needing to use all this data and all these insights to help us with fundamental change about the way we produce food? So that's the very big picture I'm starting with.
So it's a big question, and I would tend to agree if the implication is that our current food system is not sustainable. If we're going to really see this population growth at 2050 with 10 billion people, with changing diets that we're seeing, you know, in many countries, particularly in the developing world, with more protein-based diets, I don't think it is sustainable, and I don't think, you know, the impact that we have on water resources, on other natural resources, is going to be able to support, you know, this change as it is, and that's where I believe the whole ag tech approach needs to come in. So I think for me, it's a mixture of incremental improvement, which is obviously what a lot of these types of programs are trying to do. They're trying to get farmers advice and insights in how to farm in a more effective manner, but I also believe that we need, step change innovation in order to support the planet and the people on this planet for the future.
Yeah. Ian, from a New Zealand primary sector science perspective.
I think there's quite a mismatch between, we're really talking about food security here to some extent, if we're going to talk about the big pictures. And I think there's quite a mismatch between where the innovation and, my sense, the science goes, and where the consumer driver and demand is, and where the big problems are. Most of the innovation, I'm going to stick my neck out here, most of the innovation and the consumer demand is coming from quite sophisticated markets and increasingly sophisticated markets. The food security problems are not about those. They're about sustenance and food production for a population which is growing in areas where the food is not going to be produced enough and climate change is going to have the biggest impact. And I find from our own science point of view that often trying to solve those sorts of problems doesn't actually require a lot of very sophisticated technology. It often requires working across the food chain, optimizing post-harvest handling. The biggest food losses and waste are in the production post-harvest areas in developed economies. So there's quite a mismatch between where the big drive and innovation is and where the big problems are. Somewhere along the line they're going to meet. And one place they can meet is in genetics. But we know we've got a big problem around gene editing, for instance, and acceptability, but it is a huge solution. And there are probably other new innovations coming in which can be transported across. So I think at the moment we're not connecting where the big sustainability problems are, but we have the potential to do it.
Can you just add a sort of a particular New Zealand insight into that as to how what that mismatch looks like in New Zealand context?
Well, we're in an extraordinarily privileged position. We've already heard this morning that we can produce enough food for 40 million. Well, that's not going to have a big impact for the 10 billion. What we can do, though, and what we are doing to some extent, is we can transport a lot of our technology. I have a feeling this is actually countering the argument I've just put up. We can actually transport a lot of our technology and know-how into these other areas. We have no tropical crops here, but in fact in the science area we're working in Asia and in Africa. Avocado oil production in Kenya, dragon fruit and other fruit supply chain systems in Southeast Asia, where we're actually using our science technology developed in temperate climate crops and transporting that into trying to help out these other areas. Genetics is universal. It doesn't matter where you're doing it to that extent. So we can transport a lot of what we know, a lot of our know-how. And there's in our aid programs through government, through MFAT, for instance, this is very much predicated on economic development. And so it's not just about aid, it's actually about helping economic development. And so New Zealand can contribute this way to an extent far beyond what we actually do within the country.
Thank you. And now, David, your great expertise is in consumer response and markets. So what are you seeing in various places around the world about the consumers' hunger for the knowledge that such systems can deliver them, and the extent to which that is starting to shift their own consumer patterns and therefore sending signals back to farmers and food producers about how radical a change they want in food, or not?
Well, just to start, when you opened up the conference, how many people were in the world when you were born?
2.5 billion.
Right, okay. So there were 3.6 billion when I started work, once I'd finished a PhD. We'd more than double that. If I went back to 1973 when I started, there was a view that Malthus was right, that there would be chaos, that we wouldn't produce enough food. And indeed we have, that the incidence of malnutrition has declined. There's still, sadly, all sorts of people who don't get enough food. We're going to add another 2 billion. I've no doubt that we'll cope with that too over the next 20 years. Now, the degree to which we'll bugger up the world doing so is another matter. So thinking from a New Zealand point of view, it's not New Zealand's job, as has been said, to feed 10 billion. I mean, for goodness sake, you can feed 40 million. And again, linking to the little poll we had right at the beginning, where at least half the audience says that New Zealand should be focusing on the sort of the premium end of the market. And all I can do is agree with that. Looking at the overall theme of this session here of transparency and traceability, from a New Zealand perspective, that is particularly important because the food that you will be producing or should be producing will be premium, and it will be premium because it's got a story, because you've made promises which you can't taste and you can't see. And so consumers who are willing to pay more for less in many respects are willing to pay a higher, for example, for meat. They'll eat less meat, but they'll want better. But they'll want to be able to say, well, you've made these promises about your products, prove to us that the benefits are there, even though we can't taste them. So transparency, traceability, hugely important to New Zealand.
Yes, thank you. And before I come back to some more particular questions, I'm still wanting to push on about the way these systems help inform bigger change, more radical change in food production. Do you have a sense about how that might work or what those pathways look like, what sort of triggers there are in there? So again, it's this question about perfecting what we do now, an incremental change, versus signals that send us off focusing on bigger change. Any sense of how that works?
Well, I mean, I like what you said because, I mean, I think we're talking almost about two different populations. We're talking about perhaps a Western society that is having more and more demands on how food is produced and is orienting themselves to different production methods, and it's consumer preference. And we're talking perhaps other groups of people who are more about just getting the food. Mm-hmm. Of course, in Western society, we still have issues around nutrition. It's overnutrition and, effects on things like diabetes and cardiovascular disease. So we're not always in a good spot in the West as well. But I think, a lot of the ag tech that comes out of countries like New Zealand, I mean, the hope is that it will not just be applied to similar production systems in the Northern Hemisphere, perhaps the US or some parts of Europe, but that we can also look for opportunities in the developing world, where, as you said, that's where the population increase is really going to hit. That's where climate change is really going to hit. And already those folks are suffering from a lack of good food. So I hope that, this ag tech revolution will increase production systems and make them more sustainable in the developed world, but also have perhaps an even bigger impact over time in the developing world.
Thanks. Ian.
Yeah, I think one interesting thing, I think, for New Zealand perhaps, is that we should be a little bit agnostic about where the drivers come, but we should look more about what the outcome is going to be. I'm just thinking about plant protein and alternative meat products. And the push or the pull which we are reading about, which says that they're going to move away from meat eating, we should be looking to synthetic foods and that. I suspect this is not driven by a lot of intensive consumer analysis and consumer preference. I think it's driven by investment and big ideas. But perhaps we should be agnostic about where the drive comes from. But I think the consequence in New Zealand is not that we were going to shift pastoral farming into plant protein. No, heavens above, I'm an old scientist. We used to work on plant protein as a food way back in the 1960s, where we used to turn rabbits' ears green because we fed them, we fed the rabbits green plant protein. They used to photosynthesize. But the most important point about this is that the drive is actually very consistent with where I think New Zealand wants to go in agriculture, which is greater diversification. And that we shouldn't be relying, and we've all talked about it, we shouldn't be relying on an economy based on logs and on infant milk powder. We should be having a much more diversified export economy. And these drivers, doesn't matter where they come from, are actually potentially going to have a big impact in making a much stronger primary sector, I think. And I think that's where the real advantage for us is.
Well, thank you. We've got some great questions coming in, but I encourage you to use your app to send more in, because we've got some good time. And similarly, for those of you watching on the webcast, please use that function on your webcast page to offer some more questions. Here's one that is rather more of a consumer response, David. And this is from Jamie. Do you think the consumer is expecting to be able to see into the supply chain, or just needs to know that the supply chain is safe via verification or similar? And from a consumer point of view, do we really need to get down to the traceability of that individual piece of fruit?
I mean, good question. Some people want to see all the way back to the farm. I mean, others, just as you say, want the reassurance that they could if they wanted to. Increasingly, what I'm intrigued with is that people want to know, how was something produced? There's a really good Zespri example. I was talking with their board and senior managers, and one of them, the senior marketing guy, just come back from the US where they've been visiting customers. And I said, well, how did it go, you know, with the major supermarkets? He said, pretty good. And then he sort of looked around and said, had a bit of a problem with him. And he pointed to a guy, to a board member. I said, what was the problem with him? He said, well, he's a farmer. And I said, well, why was he a problem? Because when we took him into a meeting, actually all the focus of attention was on him. And people said, so how do you grow kiwi fruit? You know, it's a vine? I didn't know it was a vine. How would you do it? And so suddenly the sales and marketing guy was marginalized, if you will. So as we've already said this, that it's intriguing. Farmers have become fashionable. Mind you, that doesn't mean that every farmer should see a consumer. I mean, a fair proportion of them will put the fear of God into a consumer. But people want to know that there's a real farmer there, and they want some mechanism to be able to sort of look down the supply chain. Do they want to do it every time they have a meal? Absolutely not. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have a fully transparent and fully traceable system. And indeed, you know, in New Zealand, you have technology companies. I mean, Oratane, for example, out of Dunedin comes to mind, where, you know, they're using not DNA testing, but where they can actually prove exactly where something comes from. And what's that about? That's about brand management and just reducing the risks associated with brand destruction because of food integrity problems, which are increasingly the case.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add that I think the traceability without the transparency is not as powerful. So if you have a very, you know, well-functioning food supply chain and you just tell people that, as opposed to them even randomly going in and actually testing it themselves and actually seeing a photo of the farmer that perhaps grew the cotton that, you know, of the pair of jeans you're wearing, I think you need that transparency.
And oh, sorry, Ian.
Yeah, I'll just raise one question, though, which is a very important one, which we have to cope with a lot, and that is about consumer expectations. Yes, they want to know, and they should know, and they should look into the whole chain. But there's also a proportion of the consumer who has an expectation that, one, the food will be 100% safe, that there'll be no risk, and even some who don't want any chemicals in it, which is good luck to them. But the consumers, I'm not trying to, let's say the public, has a very sophisticated understanding of risk and cost-benefit when it steps into an aeroplane. But when it comes to food, a lot of that sophistication disappears. They want the absolutes. And I think that we have quite an issue which is at the core of this traceability and the transparency about expectations about what risk is. And I think that we see this in our biosecurity issues, we see it in our food safety issues, and a whole bunch of other things. And it's something that we really have to get right and have to have good communication with the public.
Adrian, if I may just pick up on a very interesting aspect of your presentation. The huge work that Bayer is putting into this, to the likes of the Bayer Passport, what sort of response are you getting from consumers to that, in terms of their interest and their take-up in that?
It doesn't go to the consumer in the sense that this is a program that's designed to help growers, normally, as I said, smallholder farmers, to get access to certain global markets and to satisfy the demands of the traders and the processors. the assumption on the consumer end is that all of this has been done across all of these, all of the different harvests that have made up the produce that's being sold. So this is not actually going all the way to the consumer. Having said that, of course, I mean, it's something that we feel is important to also explain to the consumer that this is going on in the background, and that these growers are actually themselves looking to enter into these types of programs. They're very open to adopting new practices, to adopting new technology, and they see the value in getting that kind of certified, if you like, so that they can then show that this is being done in this way to the next step in the food chain.
Is there a case then that one effective way of doing this would be sort of external third parties that can give the final consumer confidence all the way back through a very complicated supply chain? And are there any actual examples of that in place at the moment?
There are various certification programs. I mean, there's something called the Global GAP, which is similar to what we're doing with our Bayer GAP, but it's more of a global certification process. But I think if you start getting into food labeling, then you're opening up a whole kind of Pandora's box, because there, as we know, when we go into the supermarkets, we're now faced with a whole bunch of different labels. Some of them which do provide some transparency, perhaps, and others which perhaps hide a certain level of transparency. So when you go and buy, GMO-free water or gluten-free water, I'm not sure what that is really helping the public understand what they're getting as a product, whereas others, I think, are very informative. And I don't think we have right now the systems that are really able to properly inform the public across the whole range of foods that we purchase.
There's a zillion third-party accreditations. I mean, it's a problem. It's a problem for consumers. It's incredibly confusing. I mean, what's sort of interesting, though, too, is that, just going on from that, is that it used to be like government was the regulator. Well, as already been said here, increasingly the food retailer is the regulator. The food service organization is the regulator in terms of, if McDonald's decides to go free range in its eggs, say for its egg McMuffin, then it's like a real domino effect. It goes right across the industry. We saw that with antibiotics in chicken, for example. So, the regulator is changing. I think increasingly it's the market, and that reflects the consumer or special interest pressure.
There's a question here from Gerald, which hones in on an aspect of this. I'd like to hear the panel comment on food fraud, i.e. foreign countries passing off cheap, inferior food as their own, and how much of that is an issue. I know that Zespri's had an example of that. And what role can traceability play in stopping that?
I've got a very fine example which you'll all be aware of, which is Manuka honey. And as you probably have heard, there's more Manuka honey being sold than has been produced. This is it became a case where, in fact, the market itself was insufficient to regulate this, because our trading partners in the UK, Europe, and China were getting prepared to put down their own regulations around what is Manuka honey, and no one knew what it was. So I think that the consequence of that is that we had to do a lot of work, still ongoing, about identifying Manuka honey. It's very complex. It had to have chemical markers, DNA, had to be accepted through industry. What is monofloral, what is multifloral, what's Manuka versus Carnuka, and so on. And it's a hugely complex issue. And most foods are complex, so make it very difficult. The other side of that, as soon as you do put identifiers and regulations in, the other part of the underbelly of the trade then starts to work out how it can adulterate their product to achieve those thresholds of chemicals, and you can throw chemicals in. And then science catches up the other side, because, for instance, with sugar, we can tell what sources of sugar, whether they come from cane sugar or beet sugar or other sources, by chemical analysis. And so there's a whole sort of merry-go-round going round. Fraud on that basis, as soon as you set regulations, will always be there and always be a problem. It's a little bit chasing your tail to some extent, but if you don't, you've lost your trust.
Yeah.
And food fraud, of course, is as old. I mean, it was a big deal when Jesus was a boy. And if you take something like olive oil, for example, for the last 200 years, there's been a 50% chance that it was fraudulent. It's a classic example. You're just going to see more and more of that as you move towards a certain segment of the market wanting premium foods. Back to what I said before, the minute you start to generate a premium over and above the commodity, and particularly where it's difficult to actually to taste or see what the difference is, then somebody will take advantage of that. And so we're just going to see more and more of it. That's why you need better technology to be able to cover off traceability and transparency.
Yes, the Manuka honey one is, and the progress we're making on it's a very good example. But looking at the technology behind that, could you imagine more sort of DNA testing of a food to be able to, for somebody to be able to certify this absolutely genuinely is what it claims to be?
I think you can, but as I said, most foods are complex, and particularly honey is processed, it's blended. Most processed foods are complex, so they can be easily adulterated, but it does mean that it's very difficult to get. We want the magic bullet. We want the one compound which says this is this food, and it's not in anything else. That very rarely happens. DNA is a better one, but then not all foods carry DNA because it has to still come from the source. In this case, it comes from the pollen, which is probably still in there.
But isotope testing is alive and well in New Zealand, and you can get it down to the field. Yep. And it's world-class technology.
In terms of other technologies, DJ is asking here, are we heading towards blockchain as a technology to help us align an awful lot of information in very robust ways? And you briefly touched on blockchain, Adrian. Do you have a sense of where that's going as a technology?
I think in terms of really guaranteeing that traceability through the entire food chain, these types of technologies will be more and more employed. We're obviously at a very early stage with the use of blockchain. It's one of those buzzwords right now that people are talking about. But yeah, I can see that definitely being an important role in all of this moving forward.
Look, it's been accelerated. Walmart is running seminars with its suppliers to accelerate the introduction of blockchain. Fonterra is working with Alibaba for its anchor food brands on blockchain. It's a great example of, we didn't know what it was until about 18 months, 2 years ago, and now suddenly, whoo, it's arriving at speed.
There's a wonderful prediction in a blockchain session in Techweek in Auckland on Monday that within the next year we will, there's a high chance that many of us will have benefited from a service and will have had no idea the blockchain's involved in it. That's the speed with which it's developing as a technology. Look, there's a couple of questions here, one from Mark and one from Vincent, about, after the same sort of issue really, about the role of this traceability in being able to tell a very strong provenance story, one that has real resonance with consumers, but has a real geographic specificity to it, which would obviously benefit us in New Zealand as or in individual parts of New Zealand as exporters to the world. How do you see that connection between traceability and provenance and storytelling shaping up in the next little while? David?
Well, it's a big deal. It underpins a premium. Again, the way I describe it when I'm talking to the food firms is say, look, in general, there's very little margin in the noun, but there's a lot more margins in the adjective. So, what do I mean by that? That, chicken is the noun, chicken is the commodity, and chicken is a cheap meat. However, once you start to, from my own market, if it's Pembrokeshire free-range vegetarian, you can start to build a story and build adjectives, and that's where the margin is. And I would suggest from a New Zealand point of view that in history you've been great for nouns, but pretty poor at bloody adjectives. And you know, you've got a real opportunity here to work on provenance, and to you know, it doesn't mean you're nasty people if you focus on the richer folk of the earth, and that's probably where your natural markets are, frankly, with a better story.
Yes.
It depends. I often have a worry about this because I think it depends very much on the authenticity of what the original source is. I mean the classic case is wines, I guess. A lot of us buy wines because we'll buy Gimlet Grabble's wine because we think it's good, regardless of whether that has actually a particular effect on the wine. But I think these things are vulnerable if the authenticity of what your source is up for question or collapses. And you know, on a New Zealand scale, think about this one: New Zealand brand, New Zealand ink, clean green New Zealand. And now there's a lot of talk in the international press about our water quality, and that New Zealand clean green is a bit of a sham. And so you build up a brand based on that type of transparent traceability and authenticity, and suddenly you can get a cut away from under your feet because you haven't actually managed what the value of your source is. So there's always a bit of an issue around this one.
Mind you, the bar goes up. You know, if you take a great clean and green New Zealand, if we went back a few years, then you had a lead, if you will.
Yeah.
Now, if I'm in a conference talking, and if I say, right, will all those who are clean and green please form an orderly queue to my right, then there's a rush with the bloody Scandos or pushing people out, or the Irish and the Icelandics, or even the Australians, for goodness sake, and, you know, who are brown and dusty.
That's just the landscape, right?
And so suddenly that's not a point of difference. That you've got to be clean and green to be in the game. You can also start off by having perhaps some production advantages, that you're sort of particularly animal welfare friendly or whatever. But over time, that bar moves up. And what happens in the marketplace is that now you don't get a premium for getting over that bar, you get discounted if you don't. And so that's the issue. That's why provenance itself, geographic provenance, has something to offer, and it's very difficult to replicate.
Organic could go the same way.
Yes, yeah. Well, organic, you can see it, the blue water between conventional organic is just getting less and less and less.
Yeah.
There's a wealth of questions here that we're just not going to get to my great apologies for that. But I'm going to try and simplify or draw out some themes from all these questions. There's a lot of questions around the sheer mind-boggling complexity of the food value chain, and some real concerns about how traceability and making that sensible or an understandable to consumers is actually practical. So in other words, there's a real sense of a gap between all the traceability that's going on now versus across that very complex value chain versus giving the end consumers the assurance they want. Is there any sort of blue sky thinking that you chaps are aware of that starts to address that issue?
So I think one of the aspects, and some of the companies that we're starting to see formed are trying to address supply chain issues. And again, with the digital tools that we have available to us, I think there is an opportunity to reduce that complexity. But right now, it is intimidating. And for some, you know, relatively easy products, and wine would be a great example, you can make that trace all the way back to the producer and see a fantastic website with a beautiful vista of the vineyard. With others, it's going to be a lot more complicated, and it's going to take some time to work through that. But I think it's obvious that there is a big push in this direction, and I think tech providers in that space should really take this opportunity.
And what's more, there's a consumer push here. I mean, look what's happening in the world of processed foods, that particularly in say in higher income countries, that consumers are saying we want less complex products, we want simple products, we want fewer ingredients, we want ingredients we can pronounce, and so they're saying to the food industry, simplify here.
Of course, traceability could become a burden on the industry if you turn it around the other way. Otherwise, is the advantage of it really worth the complexity or handling the complexity of the whole issues? If it's a food safety issue, I think there's no question, but then a lot of what we do about traceability is more about brand protection, product protection, and competitive advantage than perhaps safety issues as well. So I think there's going to be a bit of a balance, but it's a very hard call. There's just one other aspect, though. One of the big science issues, and it's just been referred to in terms of making traceability work, is around data connectivity. We've got all the data we ever need or could ever hope with, and we cannot handle most of it. We have difficulty connecting up data sets, and blockchain is a great way through this because it's a dispersed management system. But I think there are simpler ways or there are ways of making this less complex, and that'll be one of them. And the greater integration of supply chain, the greater control over it, moving across different components of it in better ways. So yes, it's very, very complex, but I think there are technological ways of actually overcoming some of that.
The other big theme that I'll just put on the table, there is a strong sense coming through, it's explicit through a number of these questions, about a rising level of ethical issues that goes beyond a specific about a caged animal or whatever, to the very sort of nature of food and how we produce it. I would just leave hanging that question of how we can introduce a very strong ethical framework into traceability, so it goes beyond numbers and fantastic systems, but is very values-driven as well.
Yes.
Well, for what it's worth, and just to pop in another statistic, that if you went back, say, 30 years ago, that for all the new products launched globally that were recorded, 1% of them had an environmental or an ethical claim. If you went back to 2016-17, then 23% of all new products launched had some sort of ethical or environmental claim now. So it becomes the standard.